From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Stocks rebound, nearly wiping out Monday's losses on hopes for a breakthrough with China, after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent expressed optimism in the tariff standoff between Washington and Beijing, saying both sides need to de-escalate.
Rebound comes as the IMF cut its global economic outlook for this year and next, while hiking odds for a recession in the U.S. If a trade war continues, we're joined ahead by Greta Peisch at Wiley Rein, former general counsel for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative.
And with President Trump's special envoy heading to Russia later this week, we'll talk about the chances for a ceasefire in Ukraine with Evelyn Farkas from the McCain Institute at Arizona State University, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia and Ukraine.
Thanks for being with us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Today, the IMF cutting its forecast for economic growth for this year and next, warning the outlook could deteriorate further as President Trump's tariffs spark a global trade war. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt today reaffirming that trade negotiations are underway, specifically pointing to a potential deal with China.
There is a lot of progress being made. We now have 18 proposals on paper that have been brought to the trade team. Again, these are proposals on paper that countries have proposed to the Trump administration and to our government. The president and the administration are setting the stage for a deal with China. So we feel everyone involved wants to see a trade deal happen, and the ball is moving in the right direction.
Joining us now here in Washington with the latest from the IMF spring meetings, Bloomberg's Michael McKee. It's good to see you here at the table. Mike, we heard from Scott Bessent earlier today, just breathing the words. De-escalation was enough to spark this major rally today. Are we about to see a flurry of trade deals announced, or has nothing in fact changed?
Probably nothing in fact has changed. The Bessent comments came in a closed-door meeting. We don't have the context. But as far as anybody knows, as far as our reporting and everybody else's, China's not even responded. So it's hard to say that there's a deal in the works. And we remember what happened the last time with the Phase 1 deal, trumpeted by the president, President Trump at the time, and the Chinese never lived up to it, never bought the stuff. So it's hard to say that there's going to be some sort of magic solution to all this in the offing. We don't know what other countries are doing, but we do know the Japanese left the trade negotiations saying, we're not going to make a lot of concessions here. So what we might get are a few, as Politico put it today, agreements to talk about looking for an agreement, you know, sort of frameworks rather than any kind of deal with specifics.
Well, and in the interim, the U.S. and China have to contend with what could come of their growth trajectories with these tariffs in place, as the IMF today downgraded its forecast for both of them, yes, as well as the global economy, but also didn't even have the full height of the retaliatory tariffs in working its forecast.
Yeah, they had to tear up their forecasts on April 2nd when Trump came out with his tariffs because they were so much larger than everybody thought. And then he's backed off, and then he's gone back and forth. So they're basically saying we've got a couple of scenarios here, and we're just going to give you the worst one we have right now and call that the reference forecast. And it suggests that global growth will be cut by 0.5% this year. But the U.S. and China really take it. The U.S. is going to grow 1.5% according to the IMF. That's down by almost a full percentage point from just their January forecast. China only 3.2%. And you guys know their goal is always 5% or better. So 3.2 would be the lowest in a very long time, and it would not go over well with the Chinese.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike McKee here in Washington as these World Bank IMF spring meetings unfold. Thank you so much. And we want to get more analysis now and turn to Greta Peisch, partner at Wiley Rein and former general counsel for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Greta, we understand based on our reporting, and again, Treasury Secretary Bessent did not make these remarks publicly, but our reporting suggests he told those assembled in the room today that with tariff rates between the U.S. and China as they are, 145% and 125% respectively, that it's effectively a trade embargo that the two countries have against each other. How hard is something like that to unwind?
Well, it is pretty hard. I mean, we've seen to date that the Trump administration has indicated a willingness to talk to China, but we haven't seen them actually come to the table together. So even making that move, having the political context that enables China to do that while saving face. I mean, every country, every trading partner has its own political internal dynamics, its own domestic, posture that they have to have when dealing with the United States or any other country, and that's a challenge here. And it's a dynamic that has to shift in some way in order to bring the two parties together and start those negotiations.
So what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks here? Will there be a flurry of deals announced? Will it be a framework like Michael McKee said, we make an agreement to keep on meeting? And is that enough to prompt another review, buy ourselves another 90 days?
Well, it does sound like the Trump administration is talking to a number of other trading partners. So putting China aside, which has its own challenges, the press secretary talked about there being 18 proposals on the table. There's a lot of trading partners. They've said that over 70 have talked about being interested in having discussions. It's frankly physically impossible to have conversations of depth with that many trading partners at the same time. So I think that means that the administration needs to consider, well, what does it need in this 90-day period? Does it need agreements to agree? Does it need, they've talked about terms of reference with India. Are there quick wins that they could come to with some of these trading partners? But I think it's clear it's not going to be detailed trade agreements of the sort that we've seen in the past.
Well, I'm glad you brought up India, Greta, because that is where Vice President J.D. Vance is currently. He said this earlier today about bilateral trade negotiations.
India, we believe, can go a long way to enhance energy ties between our nations. And one suggestion I'd have is maybe consider dropping some of the non-tariff barriers for American access to the Indian market. Our administration seeks trade partners on the basis of fairness and of shared national interests. We want partners that are committed to working with America to build things, not just allowing themselves to become a conduit for transshipping others' goods.
And Greta, Bloomberg's own reporting has suggested that for countries like India or Japan or South Korea, countries this administration seems to be prioritizing first in these negotiations, part of what they want is for them to make commitments to the U.S. that they will help deter China's manufacturing prowess or potentially address trade with China as well. Is it, in your mind, possible for other forces to come together to actually exert the behavioral changes from Beijing that this administration wants, or is there greater risk that that backfires, as China warned against it this week?
Well, as you mentioned, with China's warning, there's a really fine line that these countries, these trading partners, need to walk if the administration does make demands about decoupling or taking action with respect to China. Now, certainly, if the administration's objective is to take greater steps to counter China through collective action with trading partners, they've created the leverage to do it, right? This is a moment to have that conversation and ask countries to de-link their supply chains potentially from China if the administration sees that as a risk. But it's clear that China is not going to take that lying down, that they are going to be watching very closely what these trading partners agree to and potentially take action if they see that it is directly impacting their interests.
Enter Benjamin Netanyahu. President Trump today on Truth Social saying that he just spoke with the Prime Minister of Israel relative to numerous subjects, including trade. Will Donald Trump leverage his relationship with Netanyahu to make Israel the first country we announce a deal with?
I think it's too early to tell who's going to be at the first of the line. There's obviously a very close relationship between the United States and with this administration in Israel, but I think it's too early to tell whether that means that they'll be the first off the block. It does seem like we've made a lot of progress with India and Japan and others, and so, we'll just have to see.
Well, indeed we will. And in the interim, of course, we have this downgraded growth forecast from the IMF. Greta, considering your experience at the USTR, when we consider what changes already could be wrought to the global economy, is that's really what the IMF is warning about here, is potentially shifting 80 years of global economic precedent, if you will. Can we ever really go back from this, even if there are fruitful negotiations that result in deals with some countries, or will this reordering, if you will, be permanent?
Well, I think there is something permanent that's happening here because these are relationships that even the Trump administration, did take action with in the first time that it was in place, right? So we had the USMCA renegotiation with Canada and Mexico, and yet we still are seeing actions that potentially affect or have affected those trading partners. So there's a question of, well, is a new order coming about? Will there be agreements that have lasting impact, or are we in a situation where everything is on the table at all times? And I think that the problem with that from a growth perspective and from a business perspective is that businesses really need certainty, right? They're investing billions of dollars in facilities around the world, in manufacturing, in data centers, and that's grinding to a halt in part because of the tariff situation. And I think that that's reflected a bit in the IMF's forecast as much as anything else, right? Do we know what things are going to look like next month and 6 months and a year, or do we have to wait and see? And what is that putting on hold as far as economic activity?
We appreciate the time, Greta. It's good to have you back with us. Greta Peisch, partner, Wiley Rein, former general counsel, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Thanks, as always. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is set to visit Russia now in renewed push for peace talks, just one of the developments to come out of today's war talks in Paris. Coming up, we'll discuss what, if any, progress made with Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute. She's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
As we know, Secretary Rubio is a busy man. In this particular instance, while the meetings in London are still occurring, he will not be attending. But that is not a statement regarding the meetings. It's a statement about logistical issues in his schedule.
The negotiations continue. We feel, again, we're hopefully moving in the right direction. And the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, will be heading to Russia again later this week to continue talks with Vladimir Putin.
State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce announcing Secretary of State Marco Rubio will no longer be attending Ukraine peace talks tomorrow in London. General Keith Kellogg, the administration's envoy to Ukraine, will still attend. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt there also says the president's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, will travel to Russia later this week to discuss a possible ceasefire deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Joining us now with more is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at Arizona State University's McCain Institute, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. Evelyn, great to see you, as always. Where are we on this? We can't even get through a couple of hours on an Easter Sunday ceasefire. What will this meeting bring?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on again, Joe. Look, I think this is an important meeting because what people often forget is that the Europeans have a huge say in what happens, what the outcome is with regard to Ukraine. Of course, the Ukrainians have a huge say as well, but the Europeans will have a lot of power to wield when it comes to any peace deal that involves lifting sanctions on Russia. And of course, that will be ultimately at the end of the day, once we have no war anymore, we will probably lift the sanctions. But the Europeans have to be part of that because there's greater economic interconnectivity between Europe and Russia than there is between us and Russia.
All right, Evelyn, we'll hopefully return to this conversation, but right now we do want to go live to the Oval Office as President Trump is taking questions from reporters and talking about trade deals, specifically with China. Let's listen on Bloomberg TV.
But they're not doing that anymore. Yeah.
Mr. President, will you prevent Hamas from having any role in governing a post-war Gaza? And will Hamas have to be permanently eradicated for a ceasefire to be reached?
Well, we're not going to let Hamas do that, and we're going to see what happens with Gaza. But we've made a lot of progress in the Middle East. Tremendous. Should have never happened. That date, that very special date, October 7th, should have never happened. It would have never happened if I were president. But we'll be stopping that whole situation. Yeah, please.
Earlier today, Treasury Secretary Bessent suggested that with tariff rates as high as they are now, it's effectively an embargo of trade between the United States and China. Do you see it that way?
That's true. 145% is very high. and it won't be that high. It's not going to be that high. It got up to there. We were talking about fentanyl, where, various elements built it up to 145. No, it won't be anywhere near that high.
And what level do you think it'll come down to if you haven't?
It'll come down substantially, but it won't be zero. It used to be zero. We were just destroyed. China was taking us for a ride, and just not going to have. It's not going to happen. We're going to be very good to China. Have a great relationship with President Xi, but they would make billions and billions and billions of dollars a year, and they would build their military out of the United States and what they made. So that won't happen. But they're going to do very well, and I think they're going to be happy. And I think we're going to live together very happily and ideally work together. So I think it's going to work out very well. But no, it's at 145%. It will not be anywhere near that number.
Mr. President, Greta Peisch with the Daily Caller. On the work that your team is doing on the border, are you happy with the rate of deportations right now?
Oh, it's amazing what they've done on the border. Thank you for the question, because honestly, it's one of the great successes. We have virtually nobody coming in illegally. We do have people coming in legally because we want people to come in, but we have nobody coming in through the border virtually. We were having hundreds of thousands of people a month come in under Biden, and they came in from prisons, they came in from mental institutions, they came in from gangs in Venezuela and other countries all over the world, not just South America. They were emptying their prisons into the United States. Venezuela emptied its prisons out, but many countries emptied their prisons into the Congo, as an example, in Africa, emptied their prisons into the United States. And we're getting them out. And I hope we get cooperation from the courts, because, we have thousands of people that are ready to go out. And you can't have a trial for all of these people. It wasn't meant, the system wasn't meant. And we don't think there's anything that says that, look, we are getting some very bad people, killers, murderers, drug dealers, really bad people, the mentally ill, the mentally insane. They emptied out insane asylums into our country. We're getting them out. And a judge can't say, no, you have to have a trial. The trial's going to take 2 years. And no, we're going to have a very dangerous country if we're not allowed to do what we're entitled to do. And I won an election based on the fact that we get them out, and we've done an amazing job. Look, we've stopped. Everybody admits, even the radical left, we have got the strongest border we've ever had, even stronger than what I had it for 4 years. We had a great border. We solved the problem, but it's a tad stronger, which is, I don't know if that's disappointing or not to me. I beat my own record, but I appreciate the question. Thank you, Daniel. Well, thank you, Daniel. The question is about prices. The prices are going down, not going up. One of the big things is energy is going down. I see that we had a couple of states where gasoline was at $1.98 a gallon. Nobody thought they'd see that for years, maybe, and that's a big thing. And we opened up our wells. We opened up our drilling. We have more product now for sale. And we're also going to be selling outside of the country to a large extent. It's going to bring down our deficits, largely going to bring down our deficits. But if you remember my first week, I was standing here, Paul, and they were screaming about eggs. The cost of eggs have gone through the roof. They were up like 500%, crazy, like 4 or 5 times. And we won't have eggs for Easter, they were saying. There will be no eggs. You can't order eggs. They wanted us to order plastic in the shape of eggs. Well, yesterday we had 48,000 people at the Easter hunt. They call it the Easter roll at the White House. And we had all eggs. And as you know, the cost of eggs has come down like 93, 94% since we took office. And they're pretty much normally priced now. Great job. Our Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, did a very good job. But groceries have come down. It's all coming down. The only thing that hasn't come down, but it hasn't gone up much, are interest rates. And we think the Fed should lower the rate. We think that it's a perfect time to lower the rate. And would like to see our chairman be early or on time as opposed to late. Late's not good.
Mr. President, you've said...
I don't want to talk about that because I have no intention of firing him.
Mr. President, there are reports that you're considering doing something for moms across the country, giving them some type of bonus whenever they have a child. Are you considering that? Or are you
Sounds like a good idea to me. Yeah, please.
So to clarify, you have no intention of firing Jerome Powell because your economic advisor, Kevin Hassett, a few days ago said that you and people in the White House were studying this idea of possibly getting before his term ends.
No.
Do you have any plans on doing that?
None whatsoever. Never did. The press runs away with things. No, I have no intention of firing him. I would like to see him be a little more active in terms of his idea to lower interest rates. This is a perfect time to lower interest rates. If he doesn't, is it the end? No, it's not. But it would be good timing. It could have taken place earlier. But no, I have no intention to fire him. I don't want to comment on that. That doesn't matter.
Mr. President, you said... When can we expect the Epstein documents to be released? The rest of them?
Which documents?
The Epstein files?
I don't know. I'll speak to the Attorney General about that. I really don't know. I know that we've done the RFK. The Kennedy, Martin Luther King is out there very shortly, so we'll find out. But we've really announced we're doing them in full transparency. You know, when we did JFK, people were saying, "Oh, maybe it wasn't all; it was all," and people actually went up to the office and they looked at some things that were, not really easily available, and they were amazed that we gave it all. And I don't know if it solved any problems for people. People still have questions one way or the other, but that I'm not. But 100% of all of these documents are being delivered. Yeah, please.
Mr. President, you said you're ultimately going to make a deal with China, but where do things stand right now? Have you talked to him?
My relationship with President Xi is great. It's been great for a long time. We've had a very good relationship, and I think we'll make a deal with China. If we don't make a deal, we'll set it. We'll just set the number, and I think they'll want to be a part of the United States. We're doing great. This is the golden age, as Paul said. We're talking about the golden age. There will never be a time like this, in my opinion, and China wants to be a part of that too.
Mr. President, are you meeting with investigations, sir, on the Butler investigation? Are you getting intelligence briefings, and do you think will
I have. I'll keep that to myself. Very personal.
Are you concerned about the impact of tariffs on West Coast ports with just sharp drawdown in Chinese imports coming in?
No, I think that everyone's going to do well in this country because of tariffs. We have $7 trillion of investment already. You can go back many years, and for a whole year, they haven't had anywhere near that. Mostly, they'd be well under $1 trillion of investment. And we've got $7 trillion. We really started 5 weeks ago. And in just a few weeks, literally, we have $7 trillion, which is a record for a year. There's never been a year with that much. And that's coming in, I think, for two reasons. It's coming because of an election that people liked, and it's coming in because of tariffs. And if you look at Apple's going to start building here. Right now, they're in China mostly. $500 billion. We have all of the computer chip companies are coming in at levels that nobody's ever seen before, as you know. Jensen came in for $500 billion. You saw that. A great guy, highly respected. Mr. Wei coming in for $250 billion. Nobody's ever seen anything. And the auto companies are coming in. I can name 8 right now already, auto plants that are either starting or about ready to start construction. There's never been, and the United Auto Workers and the non-union workers in the automobile industry, they love Trump, and I love them. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Congratulations, Paul.
That's live from the Oval Office. President Trump speaking to a range of issues there, actually taking some questions from reporters on an event that was initially set to be closed to press. It was actually for the swearing in of the new head of the SEC, Paul Atkins. But we covered a lot of ground there, specifically the headline that you're seeing on your screen. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, no intention of firing the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell. Kayleigh, that is a very different message than we heard even 24 hours ago when he used the word termination in a post on Truth Social.
Yeah, indicating that he's been too late to cut rates, though I would point out the president still suggested he would like to see Powell moving early or now on an interest rate cut, but said it's not the end of the world if he does it. And you are seeing, I would note, a market reaction to the president's words just now. Obviously, futures do not open for another half hour or so. But if we look at some of the ETFs that track the big equity benchmarks, SPY, for example, which tracks the S&P 500, saw a big spike immediately after the president said those words in the after-hours trade. Same goes for QQQ, which tracks NASDAQ 100, although Tesla may be a factor there as well after its earnings report after the bell. We'll get more into that later on this hour. But really the big headline here, in addition to his comments on thinking that the U.S. can reach a trade deal ultimately with China, that tariffs will be lower than 145% at that time, is that he has no intention, he says, of firing the chair of the Federal Reserve.
Pretty remarkable for a market that did, pretty well today, considering the news and the commentary that we heard from Scott Bessent. This is a whole new leg higher, having seen some major losses based on a lack of confidence around the president's relationship with the Fed chair. Talk again about a shadow Fed inside this White House. Apparently all of it was just that, talk.
Yeah, keeping in mind, of course, the chairman's term does end a year from now, roughly May 2026. But we want to get more on the president's remarks just now and turn back to Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent, who's back with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So no intention, he says, though, of course, Mike, there was a massive legal question as to whether or not he would have the authority, even if he did have the intention.
Yeah, that legal question hasn't been settled. But I think you go back to the old saying out west, there ain't no education in the second kick of a mule. The story came out that he might fire Jay Powell, and you saw what happened to the markets. And I think the president and his people saw that. After he suggested it might happen, there were further stories that talked about, they've been talking about this for a long time. They're planning. They're talking to Kevin Warsh. They're talking to Kevin Hassett. And Kevin Hassett suggested as much. So I think somebody got to, maybe Scott Bessent got to the president and said, you're creating your own problem here. Doesn't mean he won't eventually try to do it. But the question has always been, why bother? Because if the chairman is going to go to court and fight you, and that's going to take a while, by the time you get a decision, he's out of office anyway. His term as chair ends in May of 2026.
Well, let's remember what Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social. There can be a slowing, he said, of the economy unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates. Was he trying to get ahead of this IMF forecast that was cut today?
I don't think so. I think it is just everybody's been forecasting. And there's been so many people on Wall Street who've said we're probably going into recession. And I think the president was reacting to that. The IMF doesn't carry a huge amount of weight because so many other people on Wall Street do forecast the United States that you don't have to wait for that to react. But I think he has an antipathy for Powell because Powell doesn't cut interest rates when Donald Trump wants them cut. And that comes through very clearly. But I think he's recognized that it's not going to help him or the economy if he were to go farther.
Well, and as we're considering the IMF forecast, knowing that it does paint a more dire, not necessarily dire, but a worse off growth outlook than just months ago, Mike, is there no argument to be made that President Trump doesn't have a point that interest rates might need to be lowered sooner rather than later, that the Fed risks being too late, knowing that monetary policy does operate with a lag?
Well, I think the Fed knows that it's going to be late. By definition, they'll be late because they have to wait and see, because we're in a situation now where both sides of their mandate are threatened. We could have growth slowing significantly, but we could also have, because of the tariffs, inflation going up. And that was exactly the point that Powell made last week in Chicago, that the Fed would have a very uncomfortable decision to make at some point. Which one do you deal with? And obviously, the president seems to care more about growth than about the inflation question. I think we've heard from the president many times that tariffs don't cause inflation. I don't know if he really believes that or not. But he doesn't seem to think the Fed should wait to see which one of those comes true. They should just cut right now.
All right. Michael McKee, great to have you with us here again in Washington, D.C. We're just getting started here. IMF week, spring meetings. Michael McKee is here for the duration, and we're lucky to have him as President Trump, if you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, says from the Oval Office he has no intention of firing Jay Powell as chair of the Federal Reserve. We'll keep our eyes trained on futures, as Kaylee mentioned, when they open a little bit less than a half an hour from right now. Early indications are, Kaylee, that this could be a bit of a relief rally and another leg higher when we open tomorrow.
Yeah, if you check on the post-market trade for SPY or QQQ, the ETFs that track some of those major benchmarks, they are higher in the after-hours session. And that spike did come after this headline from Chairman Powell, though, of course, earnings from Tesla, which is a big mega-cap company, are factoring into that as well. And it also could be, at least in part, what the president said about trade and China specifically when answering questions from reporters in the Oval Office, suggesting he does think they will get to a deal, that it will mean that tariffs eventually are lower than 145%. But of course, we know conversations are not actively happening right now between Washington and Beijing, even as President Trump just touted his relationship with Xi Jinping.
Yeah, that's the fact of the matter that we heard from Scott Bessent earlier. Despite the optimism, the phone's not ringing. And joining us now with a bit more perspective on the way the White House is communicating its tariff policy, on again, off again, is Lanhee Chen, fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution, lecturer at Stanford Law School. Lanhee, great to see you back at the table. Thank you for joining us. This is not the way you probably would have designed the rollout for a major policy change. It's the on again, off again. It's the uncertainty that has been the issue almost as much or more than the tariffs themselves. Are we getting on the same page here?
Well, look, I think the other issue you have is what is the rationale for the tariffs? And we've heard different explanations from different members of the administration. Some have said it's a negotiating tactic, which I think Wall Street and folks in the markets are generally more amenable to. Then some fundamental effort to, for example, reshore large segments of the economy, which is going to be admittedly much more difficult. But I do think what we heard in the president's remarks just right there was optimism about the China relationship. And that, frankly, I think has been the big dark cloud that has loomed over a lot of this. And so if we have some certainty, for example, that the president's really working toward this so-called grand bargain with China, I think that will give people a little bit more comfort of a positive resolution, which we really haven't had in several weeks.
We heard from the Treasury Secretary, although not directly, just based off people who were in the room when he addressed a closed-door session of investors here in Washington, the suggestion that the current dynamics between the U.S. and China when it comes to tariffs are unsustainable. When the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury is suggesting the administration has arguably helped contribute putting itself into this situation is not a sustainable one, what does that say to you?
Well, I think it's an acknowledgement of reality. In some ways, which is to say that the status quo with the escalation and the not talking to each other, that isn't sustainable. It's not certainly not sustainable for China. We know that. For the United States, it's not comfortable. And so I think it's a recognition that we have to move towards some kind of a de-escalation here, one way or the other. It is going to eventually impact the U.S. economy. It's going to impact how our economy performs. It's going to impact how people perceive the U.S. economy, the stability of business that's being done here. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why I think it was great for Secretary Bessent to say what he said, because it's the reality of where we're at.
Well, reading between the lines here, what we just heard in the Oval Office, you sense optimism. We certainly got that from President Trump. He had a couple of messages to deliver, though, including the fact that he has no intention of firing the Fed chair. That's not what he was saying just 24 hours ago. What has happened inside this White House? Was it simply watching Wall Street respond?
I think that's part of it. I think it's a desire to, again, sort of try and demonstrate that there is going to be some systematic way in which these policy changes are happening. But look, I think there's no question the markets have an impact on every presidential administration. And certainly this one is no exception to that rule. So I do think that played some factor.
You wake up to headlines like today, and it's the worst start of the year. It's the worst run for the S&P 500 since the inauguration in 100 years. That includes, of course, the Great Depression. Donald Trump doesn't want superlatives like that, does he?
Those aren't the exact headlines that they would have wished for, I'm sure. But again, I think one of the things that this administration has that a lot of administrations, including ones I've served in, don't have, is a measure of flexibility, one would say, in terms of what the president's message is, in terms of what the administration's message is. They're not afraid to say, you know what, don't worry about what we said yesterday. This is what the operative issue is today. It's hard, I think, for market participants to participate in that situation, but that's the reality of where we're at.
Well, I also wonder, is President Trump, while he said he has no intention of firing Powell, still reiterated that he thinks Powell needs to cut interest rates now or soon, that he risks being too late. If you also see this as setting the stage of messaging, if we do see a downturn in the economy, for someone other than Trump and the administration to blame.
The fall guy, And look, I mean, I think that's certainly a predictable. By the way, not new messaging from the president. The president's always talked about.
We heard this in 2018 too.
We heard this a long time ago, right? And so, to some degree, this is about positioning what the president's trying to do, what his administration's trying to do, the series of policy changes they have against the backdrop in reality that the Fed and ultimately monetary policy are going to drive as much of the economic situation over the next 6 months as anything the president and his administration might do.
We're seeing a big pop after the bell here in the SPY and the Qs. If you're with us here, Russell 2000 moving higher, at least the ETFs that track them will have real futures coming up at 6 o'clock. But look at these numbers. Look at the green on the screen here, Lanhee. It's pretty important. What would be your advice to this administration about staying on message in the days ahead?
Well, look, I mean, I think that they need to communicate clearly going forward what the rationale is going to be here, right? We've had a pause on the reciprocal tariffs. We've got some indication that maybe the China escalation is over, if we believe the comments we've just heard a couple minutes ago. Yep. All of these things should be cheered and are being cheered by market participants. So I think the question now going forward is, what can we expect in terms of the philosophy animating these tariffs? If we have some confidence this is a negotiating tool, that's going to dictate one set of responses. If we believe this is an effort to fundamentally restructure the U.S. economy in the way that Peter Navarro and other advisors have indicated, that's a very different pathway.
Sure it is.
That is one that is much more unsettling for people who are participating in this economy than for one that says, listen, we have a bunch of negotiations. By the way, the president's not wrong about some of these negotiations that have to happen. If that is the strategy, that needs to be clearly communicated. I think that's been the message that a lot of people have sent from day one. Obviously, there's been some hemming and hawing on that.
If ultimately this is about kind of reaching these new agreements, not necessarily raising revenue, when Congress returns to town next week, starts hammering out the details of a reconciliation package that could cost trillions of dollars if these tax cuts are not offset, should they not be counting potential tariff revenue into their equations?
I mean, I think there's an uncertainty around that if they were smart, they would hedge against, which is why we keep returning to conversations about Medicaid, for example, right? What's going to happen on that side of the ledger? Because that's where all the big money is. If you think about $800 billion in savings on the House budget resolution, for example, that's a big number, and you don't get to that kind of number without potentially looking at Medicaid. So I think that the challenge is really around how much revenue will be raised by the tariffs. That has created the uncertainty that Congress has to go and say, how do we fill this hole? How do we actually get to the numbers we need to hit?
All right, Lanhee Chen, great to have you in our Washington, D.C. studio, fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution. Thank you so much, of course, helping us react to the breaking news from President Trump that he has no intention of firing Fed Chair Jay Powell. You're seeing some market reaction as a result in SPY and QQQ. As we track those ETFs in post-market trading, they are rallying. Tesla up, too, as Elon Musk says there's blowback from his U.S. government work. We'll have more on Tesla earnings later on in the show, plus continue our conversation on Trump's comments on Powell with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's a perfect time to lower the rate, and would like to see our chairman be early or on time as opposed to late. Late's not good.
Mr. President, you've said
I don't want to talk about that because I have no intention of firing him.
Some news made a short time ago. You saw and heard it live here on Bloomberg. The president just moments ago in the Oval Office saying he has no intention of firing the Fed chair, despite suggesting as much for a couple of days so far this week. Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Laura Davison. What's the message going to be tomorrow? We were hearing about termination just 24 hours ago. What changed?
What changed is that the markets did not respond well yesterday. We saw markets down, and today we saw a little bit of a rally here. But this is an issue that he has his advisors in his ear saying, look, you need to project stability. People need to know that you're not going to go in and suddenly upend things at the Fed. And this is Trump coming out saying, look, at least for now, quelling any of those fears. Trump likes to kind of go up to the line here. We saw him. He was never clear when he said Powell's termination can't come soon enough. He never said I would terminate Powell, but he highly suggested it. This is him pulling this back in this sort of cat and mouse game that he really likes to play.
Keeping in mind that the termination of his time as Fed chair is scheduled to be up in May of 2026, so only a year from now. When you say, though, the idea that there's advisors around him who are saying, hey, watch the markets, pay attention, is this really Scott Bessent speaking through President Trump here?
You're certainly seeing a lot of influence on him. Remember Trump also just a couple weeks ago says he wasn't watching markets at all. Today, just in the Oval Office moments ago, he said markets are up nicely today. So you can kind of piece together some of these hints of what's going on in his mind. We also, have reported that Scott Bessent said that this trade deal will come together with China. Trump, again, came out and told reporters that, yes, he thinks the deal will come together. No no evidence yet that talks have started or that there's anything happening, but he suggested that he would lower that 145% rate on tariffs substantially.
Yep, but someone still needs to pick up the phone to get those talks going. First, Bloomberg's Laura Davison, thank you so much for running into the studio for us. And joining us now for more on their reaction is this evening's political panel. Lester Munson is with us, co-head of the international practice at BGR Group and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Jim Kessler, executive vice president for policy at Third Way. Welcome to you both. Lester, I do wonder, to get back to Joe's question, what you make of the messaging we're getting today versus the messaging we're getting before. Do you really believe that the president never had any intention, or at least hadn't thought about firing the Fed chair?
Oh, it sure seems like he thought about it. And it seems like today he thinks it's a bad idea. We'll see what he's thinking about it tomorrow. And maybe the next day. I think he's very flexible, and he's willing to kind of adapt to circumstances. And I think that's what we're seeing. And in a way, maybe that's a good thing.
What do you think here, Jim Kessler? Was it the White House watching the market reaction, or maybe coming to terms with the fact that the president does not have the authority to fire the chair of the Fed?
I think he was spooked. He was spooked by the market. And, Liberation Day, April 2nd, he was spooked by the reaction then. And April 9th, he pulled back. He did the 90-day pause. So, I mean, look, let's be honest here. We've seen the president move quite a bit because of reaction either from business or the markets. And I think foreign leaders are noticing, too. I expect he'll get a lot of trade deals, but I don't expect they're going to be like these great trade deals for America the way he promised. I just think they know when the markets are reacting badly, he moves.
Well, and then it becomes a question of if the economy starts reacting badly. Markets and the economy, Lester, as we know, are not the same thing. There's a bit of a lagged effect there. But his suggestion yesterday that there could be a slowdown if Powell doesn't act now, kind of an admission that there actually could be some deterioration in the economy, arguably, as a result of the policies of this administration with policy this tight. And I wonder how you think that factors into the way in which the White House, or the president specifically, is messaging around monetary policy.
Well, I think it has everything to do with it. He's highly mindful of his domestic policy agenda, which includes getting the Budget Reconciliation Act through Congress, which are his big tax cuts. He needs to keep things stable and on track for the next couple months. He needs to keep the Freedom Caucus in line. He needs to have a certain level of popularity. I do think he is focused on getting his agenda done, particularly this year. And so he's going to be willing to move around on some of these issues, whether it's tariffs or Powell or other things, if it's necessary to do that. I think maybe we should all just hope Peter Navarro goes on vacation for a couple of weeks, and that'll give him even more flexibility.
I think there might be some other folks happy about that in the White House. As we hear, Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick had to buttonhole the president while Peter Navarro was in a meeting, which may have brought us to this point now. How much time does the White House have, and is it just a 90-day review period before we need to start seeing some deals here for the market to take this seriously?
I think this administration has given itself a lot of flexibility. Say what you want about the wisdom of the tariffs. It doesn't seem like it was a good idea. The markets reacted quickly. But the president has a ton of flexibility here. He can declare a deal without even really picking up the phone with China. Okay. You can just have an arrangement that we're just going to focus on maybe some of these security sectors where there's dual use items or technology that can be used for military purposes. I think people understand tariffs on those items, and that makes some sense. These other areas of consumer goods and other things that aren't as critical, let's go ahead and open it up. That seems like the logical thing to do. I think they're going to get there sooner rather than later.
On the subject of tariffs, Elon Musk is currently addressing tariffs on Tesla's earnings call after telling those on the call that he'll be pulling back significantly from his duties with the Department of Government Efficiency in May, that he'll be allocating far more of his time to Tesla, which seems to be something of music to investors' ears if you look at the after-hours trade of the stock. He also says that he'll continue to advocate for lower tariffs, though tariff decisions are entirely up to the president. And Jim, as much as we talk about the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent or Howard Lutnick, some of the actual cabinet secretary voices that are in Trump's ear on these economic policies, to what extent are the more business-minded individuals like Elon Musk influential as well?
I think for every 50 calls that Donald Trump gets on tariffs, one of them is in favor and 49 are opposed. And those calls are coming from members of Congress, they're coming from business leaders, and they're coming from close political friends like Elon Musk. And I do expect that you're going to see pullback on the tariffs and deals that he's going to be cutting with other nations. He will make them seem like they are major deals, they're probably going to be minor deals because he's in a weakened position now. He's moved several times, and the economy looks very soft, and nobody wants a recession in their first 4 months of the presidency. So I expect, we'll call it flexibility. I think he's been bullied into moving.
Well, we know for a fact that Elon Musk made a direct ask, tried to intervene on the reciprocal tariffs, the auto tariffs. Lester, what happens if that scenario that Jim Kessler just mapped out is the case? We get a couple of deals, but nothing really moves the needle here. We kind of walk away from the tariffs. Does Peter Navarro still have a role in this administration?
Well, I think the president likes to keep him around. He is useful politically. And I think it's probably more than 1 out of 50 calls. I think there were a lot of unions that are a key constituency for President Trump that were very much in favor of a lot of the tariffs that he announced recently. So this is a part of. There's a direct relationship for kind of the new Republican Party that Donald Trump has put together, more working class, more blue collar, more union oriented. They did appreciate this stuff. Peter Navarro is going to have a full-time job, I think, for the rest of the administration as long as he wants it. I just hope he gets a lot of vacation time.
He did go to prison for the president, arguably, after all.
Couple months of that.
As we consider the kind of prospects here, Jim, of reaching some kind of agreement, whether it's in the 90-day window or otherwise, is it so much that it matters where we are in July at the end of those 90 days or where we are in terms of tariff levels and where the economy is as a result come November of 2026 when we're considering the midterm elections? Is that the first real tell, if you will, that we'll get around these policies and how they play with the electorate?
There's usually a point in every presidency, new presidency, where his allies in Congress start to drift away from him, and it usually happens the first August recess. So if we're seeing a softening economy this summer, when members of Congress come back from August recess in September, and they are fearful of their constituents, you will see a pulling away from Donald Trump and, a lot more chances for maybe bipartisan negotiations after that. But his hold over the Republican caucus in the House and the Senate will diminish because they are fearing their jobs and a bloodbath November 2026.
Well, that's saying something. We haven't seen too many town halls here, Jim. What have lawmakers learned in their time at home?
Well, it's hostile for them, for Republican members. Like, Byron Donalds just had a town hall or a campaign event. Like, it just went very, very poorly in Florida. And it's happening with all Republicans. Like, what they're doing is not popular. Look, every administration overreaches when they start out. This one is overreached more than any I've ever seen, and there's a backlash that's going on. Normal people are upset, not just the activists.
I also wonder, as we consider the upset of people, we've heard a lot of people being upset, including at that town hall with Byron Donalds, about the Department of Government Efficiency specifically. And Elon Musk has been able to be the punching bag for a lot of that, Lester. But Elon Musk just told Tesla investors coming up in May, he's going to be spending a whole lot less time on that, focusing back on Tesla. Does President Trump need another punching bag to show up?
And I'm sure there are plenty of billionaires who would volunteer for the job. I think the timing, it tracks, though. President Trump is interested in getting his budget reconciliation bill done. He's actually more worried about backlash from the right than from the middle because his spending plan is a moderate one. It is not a right-wing one. And the Freedom Caucus guys are the ones who are upset. He's going to keep Elon Musk around to catch some of the spears, but also to let the Freedom Caucus know that he is for cutting government spending through DOGE, even if some of that is a bit of a mirage. So this May timeframe that Musk is talking about, I think, tracks with a plan about a legislative plan to get budget reconciliation across the finish line.
It's also consistent with what we've heard from the administration here and the tenure that they expected would last through the end of May. Lester Munson and Jim Kessler, thank you so much, both of you, for a great conversation and a great panel. We want to lean into the Tesla results here as we speak, of course, coming in after the bell. And back with us live from San Francisco is Ed Ludlow, the host of Bloomberg Technology. Ed, it's great to see you. When I look at the headlines on the terminal, Tesla profit misses. Carmaker warns more tariff pain ahead. Tesla rallies. Musk says he'll limit time with government. So is this about to be over?
Yeah, and he just hit it head on in the first opening minutes of the earnings call. It's what investors wanted to hear. Starting next month, May, he will step back and dramatically drop the amount of time that he spends with DOGE. And he sort of reiterated his commitment to Tesla. But, you know, in aggregate, not just what the discussion's been in the opening moments of the earnings call, clearly tariffs in the trade environment has been painful for Tesla. And Musk was candid, basically, that he believes in lower levels of tariffs. And he has shared that belief with the president. But ultimately, I think, as you reported in real time on air, it is up to the president of the United States, says Elon Musk, to make that call. But he has shared with him his beliefs on the subject.
Well, and on tariffs, at least in Tesla's release, it says it's difficult to measure the impacts of shifting global trade policy on automotive and energy supply chains, our cost structure, demand for durable goods and related services. Even if you can eliminate the key man risk, if you will, Ed, that is still a massive overhang on this company, is it not?
Yeah, it's an overhang. Clearly, uncertainty has hit the stock, but there is some evidence that in the top line and in terms of sales, there is some uncertainty as well. Where Tesla might be particularly exposed is its Shanghai-based manufacturing of energy storage, so batteries for utilities, commercial customers, residents, because there is a greater degree of supply chain exposure on lithium and specialist batteries for those packs, even if they end up in North American or European markets. And they discussed that. But they also were very bullish about China, right? That they feel they have a competitive cost structure there. It is a very competitive EV market. And, you know, they acknowledge a, quote, changing political landscape, which was bi-directional, right? I don't think Musk is just talking about pain in the United States among the electorate, but also the Chinese consumer who might not want to buy a US product at this time.
All right, Ed Ludlow, host of Bloomberg Technology, thank you so much as we work through the breaking news out of the Tesla earnings call and breaking news out of the Oval Office. As again, President Trump said he has no intention of firing Fed Chair Jay Powell. You've seen the reaction in the after-hours trade for SPY and QQQ. And Joe, we're about 5 minutes away from futures opening up, and we might see a little rally underway on those remarks.
I think we have a sense of where that's going to be going as well, much like at 9:30 tomorrow. So be back with us tomorrow, live from Washington. We'll have a lot more here in the meantime. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You've got a lot to catch up on. Find it on the terminal and online.
And we'll see you for the Wednesday edition. Have a good evening, everyone. This is Bloomberg.